Conservative American Message, hosted by the one, the only, Cam Lau. It is Monday, June the 10th, 2024, and you are listening to the 75th episode of this podcast. Channing Pollock said, "A critic is a legless man who teaches running." Ironically, I imagine that quote will be considered ableist by my critics. If you support what we're doing here at the Conservative American Message, please show us your support by making a purchase in our merch store. Go to campodcast.square.site or click the link in the description of this episode. If you want to support the podcast for free, give us a 5-star rating and follow or subscribe wherever you listen. To stay up to date with everything we got going on, follow us on social media at the Conservative American Message on Instagram and Facebook. In Florida, Governor Ron DeSantis has long been a champion for school choice. His policies have led to one of the biggest exoduses from the public school system in this country. I don't appreciate the arrogant boasting from the governor about how Florida is always the first in the nation with so many different conservative policies, because typically he's actually months behind the same policy being enacted in places like Iowa. But my biases aside, he is doing great things for the education of young Floridians. Some of the largest school districts in their state have been forced to close some of their schools due to low attendance and subsequent reduction in funding. This is being portrayed as a negative effect of school choice, but in reality, this is the goal. I don't want the public school system to fail, but it already has. Public schools do an absolute piss-poor job of educating students, and it's not due to a lack of educators or educators' compensation for that matter, and it's not a lack of funding either. It is a federal Department of Education that controls not only the curriculum, but even the methods of teaching that just aren't working. For thousands of years, humans have had formal education. The goal of education used to be and should be to equip students with relevant information that will be of use within their careers and their life. The goal of our public education system is blatant indoctrination. Schools being forced to close because parents are opting for something better, I think that might be capitalism. I don't know that we'll ever reach this point, but the best case scenario would actually be for all public education to cease to exist. That's right, it could be entirely outsourced to the private sector. Even if taxpayer dollars had to fund some of the tuition for some of the population, that would still beat the government directly in charge of your kids. The biggest problem, or the biggest obstacle I should say, with education reform is probably the teachers' unions. I know some great teachers who don't believe that just because their union says something that's the absolute fact. I even know some teachers who don't even associate with unions at all. But sadly, a majority of public school teachers in this country are completely and utterly brainwashed. Any attack on public schools becomes a personal attack on them. And most of these teachers who think that way are extremely foolish and entitled. If you truly care about education, then let's talk about the best way to educate, rather than just whine about making more money and receiving more funding and resources. It's just this government employee mentality that just gets me so worked up. Where most of us work in the private sector, in order to receive more compensation or resources, we have to work for it. A salesman has to sell more of his product to make more money. A construction worker can make more money by proving himself to be a competent and skilled worker. A farmer has to take on risks and grow a crop to sell. But in education, nobody is tracking the metrics. Test scores are on the decline, yet higher wages are being demanded? I think not. And it's not the teachers that are to blame. It's the way they were taught to teach. But sadly, we can't just pay them more for the sake of it. It has to be earned. Once again, I have to stress, this is not all teachers that I'm talking about. Most of these super entitled types are in the deep blue corners of this country. I know many great teachers that effectively educated me, and I have a deep appreciation for those individuals. But I have also had some real bad ones, and one bad teacher kind of ruins it for everyone. I've been kind of all over the place on this, but my point is that in the private sector, those good teachers could actually thrive rather than just be paid the standard government salary for however much their tenure is. Likewise, these terrible teachers would be weeded out because when a school is an actual business, they can't afford to have ineffective employees. But before I get myself into any more trouble, let's just move on to the women's basketball thing. In the past, women's basketball was nothing more than a place for female athletes to compete. We have to face it, it was not a form of entertainment in any sense. This has been mostly true of all women's sports in general. It's not due to sexism. I mean, not even women are watching women's sports usually. It simply just hasn't been as entertaining or compelling as a lot of men's sports are. A lot of this has changed though with Caitlin Clark, the NCAA women's basketball star from Iowa who made the women's tournament more popular than the men's. If I'm being totally honest, I only watched her once in the actual NCAA championship game. But I don't watch a lot of college basketball to begin with. Regardless, she's broken countless records on the court and for viewership. Her skill, along with her humility and sportsmanship, turned her into this instant icon and role model across the country. She was now drafted into the WNBA by the Indiana Fever, making the WNBA relevant for the first time in its history. Of course, with success comes envy, and many WNBA players who have been in the league a while are extremely jealous of Caitlin. If we're being honest, the WNBA mostly consists of black lesbians. The instinct of a black lesbian is to play the victim in every possible situation. It's what they're trained to do. They claim that Caitlin is only popular because she's white and that systematic racism and bigotry is the reason that nobody watched the WNBA before Caitlin. They're shooting themselves in the foot with this nonsense because without her and all of the hype that she's brought to women's basketball, the WNBA will go back to being just as irrelevant as it was before. They need her to bring this audience so they can all benefit. Unfortunately, this is not understood, and the hatred for her is only getting worse. This other chick that plays for the Chicago Sky, Kennedy Carter, aggressively fouled Caitlin in a recent game against the Fever. It was a pretty egregious foul if you've seen the video. And I think Caitlin is somewhat used to this behavior at this point. Even in college, there was this media-created feud between her and Angel Reese. But she never actually said anything negative about Reese. And likewise, she isn't complaining about the painfully obvious hate that she's gotten since going pro. She's incredibly humble and refuses to give in to the media or drama that the rest of the league is obsessed with. Charles Barkley actually made a comment recently about how these girls are being so petty and they need to appreciate the attention that Caitlin Clark has brought them before they lose it. This is actually kind of the reason that the WNBA just hasn't been as popular as the NBA. I mean, it's full of petty black lesbians. Nobody wants to watch all this drama. They want to watch a sport. And yes, there is a lot of drama in the NBA, but LeBron James is basically a woman. And it's not nearly the level of pettiness that we're seeing with these women here. Of course, the media narrative that the WNBA is out to get Caitlin is only increasing the tension. But the world of professional sports is actually an entertainment enterprise. And hype means success, regardless of stats or skills. Caitlin Clark has done more than just become a successful basketball player. She's created a brand for herself. I think the biggest lesson we need to take away from all of this drama surrounding her in the WNBA is once again the fact that she doesn't stoop down to anybody else's level. And that attitude only makes her more popular, because nobody can be mad at that. She doesn't take a side and make it this big dramatic fight. She just focuses on the game and stays out of all that. Well, that's all I have time for anyway. Were you offended by this podcast? Good. Thanks for listening, guys. I really appreciate you all. Have a great week and stay conservative.